Hi, my name is Jack Rackham from the Jack Rackham YouTube channel, and today I'm going to show you the family tree of the Crusader kings. That is, the very quintessentially medieval kings who left Europe to crusade in the Holy Land, as well as the kings and queens of Jerusalem who stayed behind to defend their newly captured lands after the Crusaders went home. There will be heroes, such as the illustrious Richard the Lionheart and the leaders of the Third Crusade. There will be villains, like the leaders of the Fourth Crusade. But above all, there will be kings and queens simply doing whatever it takes to keep alive a kingdom surrounded by hostile powers, where help is half a world away. We'll begin with some background information. Over the centuries, the Eastern Roman Empire had lost much of its territory to various Muslim powers that came to control the Middle East. Modern-day Syria, Israel, and Jordan, the region that can be collectively referred to as the Levant, fell into the hands of the Rashidun Caliphate after one of the most decisive battles in history at Yarmouk in 636. Then, in 1071, the Battle of Manzikert saw a decisive victory for the Seljuk Turks, who quickly seized nearly all of the empire's holdings in Anatolia, or modern-day Turkey. But in 1081, a man named Alexios Komnenos took control of the Byzantine Empire and began what is known as the Komnenian Restoration. Part of his goal was to retake all the land that was lost to the Seljuks 10 years earlier. One strategy he attempted was to ask the Pope for help. If the Pope would gather support for Alexios in the courts of Western Europe, Alexios would attempt to mend the schism between the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches. For the Pope, this was a pretty good deal. It helped him gain legitimacy over the anti-Pope Clement III, who was challenging his position, and despite what you might expect, the 11th century was really a low point for the power of the papal office overall. And so, Pope Urban II called on Catholics across Europe to join the First Crusade, and it turned out to be more popular than anyone could have imagined. In fact, before the Pope had made any plans with the aristocracy, a large group of common people charged into Anatolia all on their own. When a plan did come together, though, there were four main leaders. Hugh, a younger son of King Henry I of France, represented northern France. Raymond and Godfrey of Bouillon represented southern France, and Bohemond led his army from the Kingdom of Sicily. Each of these armies traveled independently to Constantinople, from which point they battled their way through Anatolia and began to move down into the Levant, where they would create Crusader states in their wake. After capturing the city of Antioch, Bohemond stayed behind to rule the city as its prince. Hugh was sent back to request reinforcements from Alexios, but Alexios didn't provide any, and so Hugh returned to France. That earned him quite a scolding from the Pope, leading him to return on a smaller crusade in 1101, known as the Crusade of the Faint-Hearted, where he would be mortally wounded. Following their victory at Antioch, the Crusaders faced a particularly gruesome conflict in Ma'ara. Nevertheless, the Crusaders continued their march south, conquering Tripoli and installing Raymond there as count, and finally taking their greatest prize, Jerusalem. Godfrey came to rule the kingdom, although he preferred the term Defender of the Holy Sepulchre, that is, the church built upon Calvary that contains the tomb of Jesus. He didn't take the name king because he believed the only king of Jerusalem was Jesus Christ. However, Godfrey was in charge of Jerusalem for just under a year, and his successors didn't have such qualms about calling themselves kings. There were originally arrangements made for Bohemond to succeed him, but Bohemond was tied up, quite literally, by a local Muslim ruler, and many in Jerusalem preferred Baldwin, who had also fought in the First Crusade with his brother Godfrey, so he marched in with little resistance. And it was Baldwin who had to address the fundamental problems in how the kingdom was set up. A lack of arable farmland meant that the traditional feudal system familiar to most Europeans wasn't going to cut it. And after the First Crusade had ended, most soldiers had returned to Europe, leaving Jerusalem mostly defenseless against its hostile neighbors from whom the Holy Land had just been taken. So instead, Baldwin brought in wealth from his personal holdings in Europe, and by levying taxes on pilgrims and traders, he raised the funds that allowed him to pay for mercenaries and fleets, which allowed him to conquer more land, which brought in more riches to fuel the economy. By the end of his 18-year reign, Jerusalem was flourishing, and had asserted itself as the dominant Crusader state. He then passed his throne to another member of the First Crusade, his cousin, Baldwin II. It was during Baldwin II's reign that the Knights Templar was founded, who got their name from the fact that they were headquartered in Baldwin's palace, which was said to be in the same location as Solomon's Temple. Today, the Knights Templar are famous for their role as antagonists in the video game franchise Assassin's Creed, but they were also pioneers in banking. They developed an early form of checks that allowed pilgrims to deposit their wealth in one place and redeem it in another. Finally, we get a nice, clean parent-child succession from Baldwin II to his daughter, Melisende. Queens in Jerusalem weren't permitted to rule alone, so she reigned alongside her husband, Fulk. But she was still the one true heir to Jerusalem, so Fulk was only king iure uxoris, or by right of his wife. A quick side note, Fulk had previously been married to a woman named Ermengarde, with whom he had a son, Geoffrey Plantagenet. Geoffrey married Matilda, the daughter of Henry I of England, who had been designated as his heir, but ultimately was defeated in a civil war by her cousin Stephen. So she never fully became queen, but her son would go on to become King Henry II, starting the Plantagenet dynasty. So from that point on, the kings of England and the kings of Jerusalem were technically part of the same dynasty. After Fulk died, Melisende co-ruled with her son Baldwin III, who was just 13 years old at the time. Since the time of Baldwin I, the other Crusader states had all fallen in line behind Jerusalem, but seeing the young king as a sign of weakness, they each began to assert their independence. At the same time, Muslim forces were beginning to reclaim nearby lands. The Zengids captured Edessa and had their eyes on Damascus as well, which was not a Crusader state, but an independent Muslim emirate that had been an ally of Jerusalem. The fall of Edessa shocked the leaders of Europe, who resolved to send their aid to the Levant in a second crusade. And this time, the leaders weren't just young princes with little else to look forward to in terms of inheritance, but actual kings. From France, there was King Louis VII and his wife Eleanor, Duchess of Aquitaine, who ruled much of southern France in her own right. And from the Holy Roman Empire, there was Conrad III, who had been elected as King of the Germans, but never actually received the title of Emperor. Unfortunately, before arriving in the Levant, both the French and German armies suffered major defeats in Anatolia. By the time they arrived, they had given up on reclaiming Edessa and instead focused their efforts on Damascus. The idea was that capturing Damascus before the Zengids could take it would limit the power of the Zengids and increase the power of Jerusalem. And furthermore, Damascus was considered to be a holier city than Edessa anyway. Unfortunately, the siege was a failure, and the situation for Christians in the Levant was arguably worse than it was before the crusade began. Returning to Jerusalem, Baldwin III had won a civil war against his mother, though she would return to an influential position in court until her death. Baldwin III went on to capture another important city along the Mediterranean coast and improved relations with the Byzantine Empire by allowing Emperor Manuel to retaliate against Prince Reynald of Antioch without intervention. Baldwin was succeeded by his brother Almaric. He would face off against the Zengids in Syria and defeat them in a proxy war in Egypt, which resulted in Egypt effectively becoming a protectorate of Jerusalem. But suddenly, Almaric had caught a tiger by the tail. He feared that if Egypt stabilized and grew more powerful, it would soon turn on Jerusalem, and so he attempted to capture Egypt outright. Unfortunately, he had pushed his luck too far, and Jerusalem quickly lost the position of power that it had ascended to. Almaric had 2 marriages. He was first married to his third cousin Agnes, and she bore his eldest children. So after he died, his throne went to his son, Baldwin IV. Baldwin IV is probably the most famous of all the kings of Jerusalem, because despite contracting leprosy, he ruled for over a decade and personally led his army to victory in several battles against Saladin, the leader of Egypt. Unfortunately, Baldwin IV couldn't outrun death, and Jerusalem found itself in its most challenging predicament yet. Saladin took over the lands previously held by the Zengids, unifying all the lands south and east of the Crusader states. To the north, meanwhile, the Byzantines had become embroiled in a series of internal conflicts and would be of no assistance. Baldwin IV did his best to prepare his young nephew for the role of king, making him co-ruler for the final years of his life. But Baldwin V was only 7 years old when his uncle died, and he would only live to be 9. He was followed by his mother, Sibylla, who co-ruled alongside her second husband, Guy. They were in charge for less than a year before Saladin conquered the kingdom of Jerusalem, with the sole exception of the city of Tyre. According to legend, the news was so shocking that Pope Urban III collapsed and died upon hearing it. The new pope, Gregory VIII, then called upon the kings of Europe for a new crusade. Now, while the First Crusade appears in textbooks, it's the Third Crusade that appears in novels. The three men who led it, Frederick Barbarossa, Philip II, and Richard the Lionheart, would all go on to become the subjects of legends. Richard, for instance, is a major figure in the Robin Hood mythos. However, for all their fame and glory, the crusade did not go as well as hoped. Frederick Barbarossa drowned in a river before arriving in the Levant, and Richard and Philip were only able to capture a few cities along the coast, but not Jerusalem. Instead, they made peace with Saladin on the condition that pilgrims would be permitted to visit the city. As a result, the Kingdom of Jerusalem became centered on the city of Acre instead, though the title King of Jerusalem would continue to be used. But before the Crusaders left, they became embroiled in the politics of the kingdom. Sibylla had died shortly before the Crusaders arrived, and power was now contested between her widow Guy and her sister Isabella and her husband Conrad. Incidentally, Conrad happened to be the brother of Sibylla's first husband William, which probably didn't alleviate any feelings of animosity. Richard supported Guy, but when put to a vote, most of the nobles in Jerusalem supported Conrad. As a result, Richard gave Guy the lordship of Cyprus, while allowing him to continue calling himself a king as sort of a consolation prize. Conrad, however, didn't last long. Soon after becoming king of Jerusalem, he was murdered by assassins. Not just any assassins, but the assassins, the Order of Hashishian, from whom the word assassin is derived. And to this day, no one is certain who ordered the hit. Suspects include Isabella's first husband Humphrey of Turon, Saladin, and Richard's nephew Henry II of Champagne. The primary suspect, however, was Richard the Lionheart, who was arrested in Austria in connection with Conrad's murder. After Conrad's death, Isabella married again to Henry, but Henry too predeceased his wife. Isabella then married a man named Amory, which had the effect of reuniting Jerusalem and Cyprus, but only briefly, since the kingdom of Jerusalem followed Isabella's line, and Cyprus followed Amory's line here. He also died before her, but this time by just 4 days. It was at the end of Isabella's reign that the Fourth Crusade occurred, and you may have noticed that this time, no major territory seems to have been lost. Well, the original goal of the Fourth Crusade was to defeat the Ayyubid Sultanate in Egypt, and from there to finally recapture Jerusalem after the Third Crusade had failed to do so. But in actuality, it had almost nothing to do with Jerusalem at all. Due to poor planning, the Crusaders found themselves out of supplies by the time they reached Venice, and effectively transformed into a wandering mercenary group. Venice gave them ships in exchange for their services in sacking a competing city, and following that, they attacked Constantinople in the name of a banished Byzantine prince who had promised them riches in exchange. Unfortunately, the riches never came, and so the band of marauders plundered the city, taking countless relics including the horses of St. Mark, which remain on display in Venice to this day. When all was said and done, these two men who had led the Crusaders ended up in charge of different Crusader states founded on the remains of the Byzantine Empire. Baldwin IX, who descended from the same line as the original kings of Jerusalem, became the Latin Emperor of Constantinople. Meanwhile, in Greece, a man named Boniface of Montferrat, who is another brother of Conrad and Sibylla's first husband William, became the king of Thessalonica. There's one more crusade we'll be touching on briefly as it pertains to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, but these first 4 are in most contexts the only memorable crusades, so they're the only ones for which we'll be focusing on specific European crusaders. Following the deaths of Isabella I and Amory, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was inherited by Maria, who was Isabella I's daughter by Conrad I. She was married to John of Brienne, who is a vassal of Philip II of France, so the kingdom was deepening those connections. But she did not live long, and so the throne passed to her daughter Isabella II. As you may have noticed, there are really quite a lot of queens in a short amount of time, especially when compared to most kingdoms in this time period. John continued to co-rule with his daughter, though he was really ruling on his own because Isabella had only just been born when her mother died. When Isabella was about 11, she was arranged to marry the Holy Roman Emperor, and this is where we touch on the Crusades for one last time. Frederick had been involved in the Fifth Crusade, which was another failed attempt to reclaim Jerusalem, but he didn't actually go to the Holy Land himself. After this marriage, however, Frederick had a much stronger reason to fight for Jerusalem as its king. He arrived in the Levant with a much smaller army than he had originally planned, but the Sultan of Egypt didn't know that, and was busy suppressing a revolt in Syria, and so Jerusalem was handed over without much fighting, making the Sixth Crusade one of very few to accomplish its intended goals. At this point, it would seem as though the Kingdom of Jerusalem was in great shape, with the Holy Roman Empire at its side. Things weren't so simple. Frederick II had been excommunicated 3 times by the Pope. First, because of an epidemic that forced him to delay the Sixth Crusade, for which the Pope accused him of failing to honor his pledge to God. When he returned to fulfill his promise, he was excommunicated a second time because someone who was excommunicated wasn't allowed to go on a crusade. And then he was excommunicated a third time for coming into conflict with the Pope. After Frederick died, the Kingdom of Jerusalem passed to his son Conrad II, who was elected King of the Germans, but due to a civil war, he would never claim the title of Holy Roman Emperor. In fact, no one would be crowned Holy Roman Emperor for 67 years. And during Conrad II's reign, the city of Jerusalem was once again lost, this time for good. Conrad II was succeeded by Conrad III, who also held the titles King of Sicily and Duke of Swabia, and it was in Swabia where he spent most of his time, allowing Jerusalem to be ruled by a regent, a relative of his from the Kingdom of Cyprus named Hugh. After Conrad III's death, there was a succession dispute, because according to seniority, the crown should have gone to a second cousin of Conrad II, but it was Hugh who managed to stay in power. Now, Hugh was related to Conrad III very distantly, going all the way back to Isabella I's next oldest child, Alice, who at that point had been dead for 2 decades. So with Hugh, the Kingdom of Jerusalem no longer had any connection to Germany or Italy, but it was once again reunited with Cyprus. He ruled for another 16 years, though his power was limited due to conflict with the King of Sicily, and he preferred to place his focus on Cyprus instead. Hugh was succeeded by John II, who ruled for just over 1 year before dying with no children, and it's suspected that he might have been poisoned by his brothers, one of whom became Henry II. And during Henry II's reign, everything finally came crashing down. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt conquered the whole of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and left Henry II to escape to Cyprus, where he would rule for another 30 years. After that point, the monarchs of Cyprus would continue to claim the title of kings and queens of Jerusalem, but would never recapture it, and eventually Cyprus would be sold to the Venetians. So, that was a quick rundown on the kings and queens of Jerusalem, as well as the Crusader kings who helped shape the kingdom's history. If you'd like to learn more about the history of Jerusalem, there will be a video next week with a special guest host continuing our exploration of the kings of Judea as listed in the Bible. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss it, and as always, thanks for watching.